Good morning and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is avoidance and how we can find ways to transform this self-sabotaging behavior into something that is more empowering. So before we get started on this new week, good morning, Rosalind. Happy new week, happy Monday. And to everyone who's joining us, great to have you here with us. And before we get started talking about avoidance, let's dig in and get present. So let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale, exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, all your molecules, your electrons, creating a brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale, exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's press our palms together, vigorously rub your hands together. Feel the friction, the temperature, the pressure, the motion, the tickling and tingling when you stop, and allow all those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables you to experience life. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So good to be here with you. So we're talking about avoidance, which also works hand in hand with procrastination. I think, procrastination is another expression of avoidant behavior. And this is a really good time of year to be talking about it because it's tax time and lots of people have avoidant behaviors around taxes. So I'm going to talk about my own experience because I've done some crypto trading over the past number of years, and I had sold some of my holdings to be able to harvest a loss. And I was very intimidated by trying to, or having to figure out how to validate, how to document that loss. And so I got software to try and do my taxes around the crypto. And then it was really challenging to get everything into that software. And then it wasn't giving me the information that I needed. And I felt very intimidated by all this. And my anxiety level was just growing, and as much as I was doing to manage it. And so what I noticed was that I avoided this whole thing until I really couldn't avoid it anymore. And finally got the numbers together. But the way that I did it finally, because sitting there and pushing myself to do this against my will and when I just wanted to panic and run wasn't working very well. It was just creating such an anxiety level that I had to completely unplug and detach and go and regroup because I created so much anxiety for myself around this thing. So what I found worked really, really well was to just give myself small doses rather than sitting down and forcing myself to do it all at once, which I didn't have the bandwidth for. I mean, there were a couple periods where I spent hours at a time, and then my agitation was so high that I wanted to jump out of my skin. And I imagine you've probably had experiences like that where you just get to a state of overwhelm. And it was like every road I went to led to 5 different forking paths. And it just became, I just got so overwhelmed. And I am going to venture to guess that when it comes to taxes and stuff like that, especially, stuff around money, stuff around taxes, a lot of us have high anxiety. And so that's what was going on. And to manage that anxiety, Rosalind says taxes, and I can't tell what that emoji is, Rosalind, but I know that taxes are just like an activating topic for so many people, as is money for that matter, but taxes just sort of amplifies the whole thing. Anyway, so what I found was limited short-term exposure. So sometimes you can't break up a task into little bite-sized pieces. But for me, in this situation, I was able to say, okay, well, I'm just going to look for this piece. And I would look for a little while. And then if I found it, great. And if I didn't, I'd give myself a break. And I would watch TV, or I cooked something in the kitchen, or I went for a walk, or, I did all these different things to be managing my internal state so that I could come back again refreshed, or at least at neutral, instead of this amped up, elevated, dysfunctional state that I had worked myself into over a period of concentrated hours. So I mean, I had gotten myself, and I don't recommend this because it really doesn't work. I had gotten myself into such a state that I was just I couldn't think straight, and I just had to get out of my place where I live. I just had to go away. And I did something that was fun. And then when I came back, I was a bit more refreshed. My brain was plugged in again. I think what happens that is that avoidance is in its way a survival mechanism that we cultivate, where we know that we're going to be maxed out, where, like something's going to be super stressful and super confronting, threatening. So what we'll do is, to protect ourselves from whatever that is, we'll just avoid it. We'll just go and do something else. We'll put our attention elsewhere and immerse ourselves in other things. And so it was interesting, because in thinking about what is it that I was avoiding, it wasn't just the whole tax thing. And I think that can have stressors in and of itself, because if we don't do it right, there are consequences. It's related to money, and we might end up having to pay, and we don't know how much we're going to owe. And I mean, it can go on and on. There's all these unknowns, and feeling kind of disempowered by not knowing what the unknowns are. So, like they change the tax laws every year, and I pay somebody to do my taxes, because I would rather do that than be freaking out about whether I did it properly myself and made sure that I took care of, got all the correct deductions and all of that. So I pay somebody to do that. And my business profile is such that it's just more than I care to take on. I'll pay a professional to take care of it. So For those of you who do your own taxes, my hat is off to you, because again, it's more than I care to deal with. Anyway, this was just getting information together to be able to submit to my tax professional, that it was freaking me out. Why? So it had to do with money. It had to do with consequence. It had to do with not knowing how, like being pressured to try and figure out how to do something that I'm not comfortable with, that has a lot of consequences if I were to do it improperly. And of course, in the process of that, to overcome our intimidation about whatever it is, it doesn't have to be taxes. I mean, I learn new stuff all the time. I was a professional learner for years and years, almost 20 years, when I had a software training company, an Adobe software training company. So I learned for a profession. I had to learn what was happening with the new software every time they'd make a new release. So learning in and of itself is not particularly intimidating to me. And being in a place where there's this pressure of consequence if you don't learn it right, certainly can add to the agitation. So what do we do? What do we do to self-soothe? So maybe we'll take a drink. Maybe we'll go eat something. Maybe we'll eat something sweet or salty or starchy, or, what we get to look at is what are healthy ways to be able to self-soothe in the process of doing this thing, like addressing rather than completely avoiding. How do we find ways to overcome our avoidance? I can tell you that in the process of this overcoming, this completing this task, I watched a lot of Netflix. I admit it. And I think that giving yourself a break, giving yourself permission to step away rather than, cracking the whip. I think, sometimes for some people, cracking the whip works. For me, that in itself is a stressor. So I found that once I started giving myself permission to do it in small bites, that it was a whole lot more approachable. And I also gave myself permission to have an extension for my taxes. So that also relieved some of the stressor of it. So there were a couple things going on, actually relieving some of the circumstances that I was experiencing as pressure. That helped. And also giving myself permission to take the time that I needed and to be taking care of myself in the process. So I wonder if you might try those techniques, because I chipping away at something rather than digging in and getting it all done at the same time can be really helpful when it's something that has high stress. For some people, for something that has high stress, it works to just dive in and do it and get it done. For me, I got to recognize or remember that I actually have a delicate nervous system. As tough as I think I am, I have a relatively delicate nervous system, and I really needed to be respectful of it, because at one point, I just got myself in such a state of agitation, which thankfully is not my norm anymore. I mean, I think it was perhaps in the past, but thankfully it's not a norm. And I recognized how destructive that can be. So when we're in avoidance, rather than, good morning, Bernadette, welcome. Great to have you here this morning. We're talking about avoidance. and how we tend to avoid things that we're intimidated by, that we're frightened by, or that we don't like, or that we don't know how, or, there are a number of reasons that we will avoid something. And that avoidance is actually, in its good intention, in its high intention, that avoidance is a self-preservation kind of behavior. And so we're talking about strategies to overcome avoidance. And one strategy certainly is to look at what the source of the avoidance is, like what's underlying it, where's the fear, and address that fear. And oftentimes in clearing that fear, it clears the avoidance. But in the meantime, if we're not able to access that directly, maybe we just get to be kind to ourselves rather than judging ourselves again. Let's be curious and utilize that curiosity to maybe find creative ways to address the behavior. One of the more standard psychology approaches to avoidance or phobias, fears around something, which often results in avoidance, is exposure therapy. They call it exposure therapy. Ah, yes, Rosalind says maybe another thing people avoid is the annual health checkup. I don't want to know. I feel like something might be wrong with me and I don't want to face it. So I've seen a little bit of that in myself too, where I've had a concern and I just don't want to face that concern around health because I don't want to deal with the consequences of it. And I see people doing that with health, with dentistry, like I'm going to avoid going to the dentist at all costs. I'm just going to hope it's going to go away and get better, and then it gets worse until you have to go, or you've created an emergency that didn't have to be there. So I guess the question is, how do we address the avoidance? I think the first thing we get to do is to acknowledge that we're avoiding. When we can acknowledge that we're avoiding, then at least we can get curious about, well, what's going on around that? What's underneath that? What's the reasoning, or what's the lack of reasoning, but the emotion that's driving our avoidance? And then find ways to address that and maybe comfort that part of ourselves that is avoiding, and not with cheesecake necessarily, but to find a real comfort. And it may be that cheesecake has its place every now and then too, but I find it really fascinating because we do avoid situations. Bernadette says, blueberry cheesecake, any kind of cheesecake for me, pretty much, I think, although flourless cheesecake, obviously, because I'm gluten-free, maybe not so obvious. Anyway, with this avoidance thing, there is tremendous empowerment that comes from being able to overcome those fears. Because avoidance, I think ultimately avoidance is rooted in fear. Feeling intimidated, like I don't know how. I'm afraid I'll do it wrong. And then there are the situations where we'll avoid confrontation. And just the word confrontation, no wonder we want to avoid it, right? Why does an interaction where we're expressing ourselves authentically, why does that have to be confrontation? Confrontation is creating a barrier, coming up against a wall. It's like there's this obstructive nature, even in the definition of confrontation. So confronting your fears is like, okay, I'm going to fight them head on, rather than embracing those fears. We talked last week about expanding to include, like, rather than judging and trying to exile those fears, allowing those fears to exist and acknowledge them and embrace them to heal them, rather than trying to exile them. Because if we exile them, then they become buried and they become actually more powerful to affect us. So I'm wondering, what other kinds of strategies do you employ to overcome avoidance or procrastination? I suspect that the general inclination is to judge ourselves for those behaviors rather than to get curious about them. I mean, we want to resolve them. Maybe there are certain things that are best avoided, and other things are unavoidable. And even the things that we avoid, like confrontation, if we reframe that to connection and communication, then it has a whole different experience to it. So perhaps that's another strategy, is to reframe whatever this avoidant thing is, whatever it is we're avoiding, reframe it in a way that it's more approachable, that we can address it more directly. So Bernadette says, confrontation comes with borders and boundaries, if you will. We tend to not hear the whole situation when you're in a confrontation. 100%. 100%. We tend to not, like, when we're in a confrontation, we're already in a defensive position, right? We're already going in with fists or, fight, ready to fight. Versus if we're going in, instead of confrontation, if we go in for connection and communication, it's a whole different demeanor that we bring to a conversation or a situation. Instead of confronting our fears, if we're embracing them, if we're addressing them with curiosity, then there's learning, there's new possibility and potential available to us. So Rosalind says, go to the worst case scenario. That's often what we do, right? We'll entertain the worst case scenario, and then that puts us in a compromised position in so many ways. And as ever, presence is the solution or the remedy. When we're present, we can be responsive rather than reactive, right? The thing is that when we get defensive or when we're in avoidance, there's something else operating. There's an underlying conversation going that we're not even privy to. And it takes some curious digging oftentimes to find out what is it that's operating here, what's going on here. So for I think I spoke about this last week, where one of the reasons, the big reason behind avoidance of something that would have been dramatically life improving for a client that I was working with was that it would mean that there was hope of turning things around, that their life could be dramatically better. And there was a deep, deep, deep fear of dark disappointment around hope, that being hopeful was associated with being foolish. And that hopefulness was so painful, or the potential for that hope to be dashed was so painful, that they were willing to avoid or undermine the potential for that hope as actively as they could, because the hope itself was terrifying, because hope can get dashed. Hope leaves you open to profound disappointment. So Rosalind says presence is the threat occurring right now. Oftentimes it's something that hasn't happened, but has happened in the past before. Exactly. So that's why presence, because most often the threats that we're experiencing are threats that we're pulling from the past and projecting into the future. And it's like negative projection into the future. And it's as a result of our negative projections or associations or experiences that we tend to avoid other situations that might create a similar danger or outcome or threat, perceived threat. And so, we're always looking to avoid threats, mitigate threats. It's part of our animal nature to be protecting ourselves. And so that's where the looking for the worst possible outcome could come from, is trying to protect ourselves from these unseen threats. And what happens as a result is we make our world smaller and smaller and smaller until it's suffocating. And so it's worthwhile to be stepping into this curious inquiry about our avoidance. Anyway, I've got to go. That's it for this morning. It's so good to be with you as always. I so deeply appreciate you and your open-heartedness. And I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live here on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. And I invite you to check out the other awesome programming on Enlightened World Network and Enlightened World Living. And until next time, so much love to you.